Hey BookTube, I'm already going to warn you that this video is going to be quite long because I just have random notes in front of me and I'm just going to ramble and there's a lot I want to cover. So apologies for that. But I want to make this video because I want to talk about world building. And yeah, so here we go. Regardless of what genre you are reading or writing, this can apply to both readers and writers. I'm coming across as a reader, but you can use these as a writer and apply it to your own writing. But yeah, regardless of whatever genre you're reading or writing, some level of world building has to take place. So even contemporary novels set in our present time, even in a place that's well known, like New York City, for example, you have to do some world building because you have to build that neighborhood. You have to build the culture around your character because it might not be obvious. You know, I really don't know New York that well. I know of New York, but certain neighborhoods I don't know anything about. So you have to take that and do that world building, even in a known area. Now, it is more applicable across science fiction and fantasy genres, of course. We have to create whole new worlds. And so that's where I'm going to be concentrating a lot of my video on, and a lot of my talking on, is on science fiction and fantasy world building. But it does apply to every genre. Every good book should have some element of world building in it. So there's different types of world building. There's info dumps, which can be done really badly, or they can be done really well. There are, I'm sure there's a technical term for it, I couldn't find it, but it's where you insert a newcomer into the world and they stand in as a place for the reader to kind of gather information about the world. Most obvious example of this is Twoflower in the first two Discworld novels, where he's literally like a tourist to Discworld and we have a character that's showing him around. That's a very obvious example. Another way to world build is to just kind of drop your reader into the middle of the world and not tell them too much and just have them pick up hints and clues along the way. It's not, it can be done really well and it can be done really badly, but if it's done really well, I think that is my favorite way to experience a world. You can also have an expert character guiding another character, mostly done through like a learning environment. So we see this, I guess, in like Harry Potter. Obviously, you know, we have the student Harry Potter learning from not just the teachers, but he's also learning from other students and stuff like that. So it's a learning environment, and that's how we learn about the world. Which is done, again, in good ways and in bad ways. And then there's different aspects of world building. And for me, a great science fiction fantasy novel would have all of these. And not every science fiction fantasy novel will have these, and I can still consider them good, but to be my absolute favorite, to like be top tier to me, you have to have all of these elements. So they vary from obvious things like describing the physical environment that you're in, building layouts, the colors of the world around them, describing the shrubbery and the greenery. I'm thinking Rivendell in Lord of the Rings and how well that was described, to not so obvious things like language, and even just subtle things in language. I'm going to not just pull examples from books. Most of my examples will be from books because, I mean, this is BookTube, but also examples from TV shows. So, for example, when I talk about language, if you look at Firefly, they use language as a way to world build. So not only do they speak English, but they pepper it in with a little bit of Chinese, especially when they're cursing or something like that. And that actually demonstrates the history of the world in Firefly, because you can see that it has both American and Chinese influences, which also speaks to the history of the world further. So it's amazing that way, in that you know that China and America were the superpowers at the time that this diaspora took place in Firefly. So this can also be especially found in science fiction and fantasy, where English may not be the standard language. I mean, if you're going off to another planet, chances are they're not speaking English. If you're going off into another world, into another culture, into another country, they're not necessarily going to be speaking English, or whatever text you're reading your book in. So yeah, they can insert new words and new phrases, and use the language in a different way. Here I'm thinking about like Yoda, where he speaks kind of backwards, you know. So that kind of demonstrates that he's from a different place, that he uses the language differently, and that adds flavor to the world building. History is another important thing. It's not always evident, and can be expanded upon through additional texts. If we look at the Harry Potter world, I'm going to go back before Pottermore, and before Harry Potter became the huge phenomenon that it is now. Before that, there were fan sites that used hints within the text to extract when things were taking place, and therefore when Harry Potter was born, when his parents were born, when Voldemort happened, when Grindelwald happened. Like, this was all extracted just from, you know, referencing that Harry Potter had a PlayStation. You know, it's like, okay, this is when it came out, so it can't take place any earlier than that. This is when he was born, this is when this and this happened. And, like, using that to use, you know, your own cultural history as well, because it takes place, well, part of it takes place in the real world, and using that to add to context and everything to the book. And now we have, like, the History of Magic is an actual book now. There's a lot of additional text that you can use. There's for a lot of fantasy and science fiction that aren't huge, there are a lot of online websites built by fans that delve into the history of the books that may not be obvious to first-time readers, but definitely help with the world building. I'm thinking Wheel of Time, there's a huge wikia that has all this information, and like people that seem like minor characters, they extract all this information from the text, and it adds to this whole new world that you're experiencing. I think that's great. Politics is another aspect of world building that I think is really important. I think that if you call yourself apolitical, you're really coming from a place of privilege. That everything in life comes from politics. It's very, very important, especially nowadays when it's so divided. But in world building, politics also plays a huge part. Like, you can't, it's not just pure anarchy. There's always some group with some leader. And this is where we get to see the various leaders and influencers, not the Instagram kind, in the world. So we see people in actual positions of power, like the heads of families in A Song of Ice and Fire, where we, like, literally follow kings. Or people who are more behind the scenes and more just influencing the people in power or influencing the culture at large. Like in the Robin Hobb series, where we follow people whose actions have influence on leaders and on the politics of the world, but they're not necessarily the leaders of the world. You know what I mean there. And politics always add different biases and different, even just dramatic elements to the plot. So I think they're very important. Environment is another important thing, like the literal world around people. Oh, sorry, I just lost my place. Okay. So the physical place where people are. There could be authors immensely interested in conveying architectural details. We see that in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. But it's not always that level of detail, where you can actually probably just draw a picture off the description of what he's saying to you. But it is another important element, because you want to, when you're picturing it in your mind, those of us who can, you want to actually see the physical world that the person's in, not just like this blank white space, right? That, you know, just say it's a generic world. You know, let there be some sort of spice and flavor that we can, you know, feel ourselves in the world and look around and, you know, see that, oh, there's a tree over there and I know where I'm orientated, and they go left at the tree. You know, those kind of things are important for visualizing. I also spoke about language before, but I won't speak about language again. My notes are all over the place. So there's different species, and there's different cultures, and they use different accents as well. So it's not just the way the language is used, or using different languages altogether, but different accents. And I love seeing accents written out on the page and trying them out in my head. I can never really translate them through my tongue, but in my head I have like a perfect Russian accent and a perfect Irish accent, and I think it really adds enjoyment to the text there. And it could tell you without saying explicitly, this person is from, the southern United States. If you just kind of write out their accent, you kind of get it, right? So you can use language that way. Use of language is also very important in magic systems. A lot of magic systems are based on Latin words, but even in that context, the rules around the magic system could be different. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Or it could be a whole other language that you're using for magic, just a made-up language, right? And you can construct a whole new language. Not necessarily to the level that Tolkien did, where it's like a perfectly speakable language, but it's important when you're constructing a language to make it believable. And the best way to do that is to have some grammar rules. Even if they're not, you don't explicitly write them down, have the person speak consistently. Like if they're saying, I am mad, it can't be completely different from when they're saying, I am happy, right? There has to be that I am context there, however you're going to put it, and then the other word. You can't say happy he is when you're talking to yourself. Like, you have to have some grammar rules there. Magic systems, those are part of world building for me, and there's some really cool magic systems out there, and these are very important obviously for fantasy novels. So there's no real standard magic system. Everyone makes it up. Authors make it up when they go along. Even if they share common elements. For example, wands are a very common magical item, right? But they don't necessarily share the same rules. So for example, in some texts, if they're using Latin-based words to use the magic, they have to say the exact right phrase. But if we look in, say, Harry Potter, when Ron is going after the troll, he uses Wingardium Leviosa, which means levitate the feather. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. But he uses it on a club. So what the magic system there is saying is that it's the intent behind the words as opposed to the actual words that you're saying, which I think is pretty cool. I'm thinking now in Supernatural, like they use Latin too, but if they don't say the words exactly right, no matter what their intent is, they're going to get it wrong. It's not going to work, or it's going to blow up in their faces or something. So that's just an example there. Culture. Culture is very important, but it's also kind of very hard to talk about because there's a lot of things that encompass culture. It could be using the magic system and the language and the history and the environment and all that. But there's some other things that can't be so neatly categorized. This incorporates all of these things, as I said, but also includes other things that are not so obvious. It could include things like religion. Here I am thinking of Dune and the Bene Gesserits, which I look at as a religious order, which adds a different aspect of culture there, but it's not in every world building example. It could be other beliefs, shared attitudes, things that you can't necessarily categorize. I'd also include food in this. Now, to me, food is a very important, obviously, a very important part of world building, but it's not necessary to build a world. Because, if you're in contemporary New York, I'm assuming that you're eating, I don't know, like bagels or something for breakfast. I don't know. I'm assuming that you're eating what I would eat in an everyday. But if I'm in a fantasy world or a science fiction world, I want to know about the strange things that these people are eating, and that adds to culture. I think a very good example of this is in Lord of the Rings with the Lumpus bread, because that explained a lot. That explained how elves were able to, one reason why elves were able to travel for such long distances for such long times, because they had this resource that was light to carry and, you know, gave them lots of energy and filled them up. And that actually added another context that I took from outside of the Lord of the Rings world, out of Middle-earth, and applied to the way I looked at the elves in Lord of the Rings, because it reflects on pemmican bread from North American First Nations. And that kind of informed my view of Tolkien's elves. So that food aspect was very important. I was pulling from, you know, from the text and from outside the text as well. Multiple cultures are also important to have, not just one culture, but different cultures. So especially in fantasy worlds, I think that's important because fantasy worlds generally take place over a large geographic area. And it's not just going to be all the same culture. I mean, even if you look at some place like Canada, which is massively huge, the culture on the East Coast is very different from the culture, say, in Ontario, or the culture out west. Just trying to figure out that is west. That's not probably actually west in real life, but west is generally left, right? Okay, not good with directions. Which is why I need them laid out for me in the text. That would be very handy. So for example, any science fiction set in space is likely to have different planets, right? And even if they were populated by the same type of species, the cultures are going to develop differently. So we see the different species and the different cultures in A Long Way from a Small Angry Planet, which does, you know, very good job, I think, of showcasing different species and their cultures. We see the different effects on culture from planets in Hyperion as well. And the Wheel of Time, I'm going to talk about it as much as I can. The Wheel of Time has so many different cultures in it that makes it so engaging to read, even when there's not a lot happening plot-wise. You know, I find it so fascinating, like they're in the city and they're exploring different cultures and they have to, you know, be careful what they say in certain places because it may be taken in different ways, or like the men have to hide because, you know, the women in the cultures are very aggressive, or the women have to hide because they're not sorry, they're you know, at risk of being kidnapped or assaulted or something. There are also novels that don't rely on plots, but solely rely on world building. And the two examples that spring to mind here are Utopia, which has a basic plot, but the main thing about the novel is that he's exploring this new world. And we also see that in Erawan by Samuel Butler, who's very similar, just describing the culture and the world that he has discovered. Another example of that, which has a bit more of a plot and which I highly recommend, it's one of my favorite novels, is A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James DeMille, which takes the idea of like Utopia and Erawan about finding a new culture, but adds a little bit of a plot in there. So it's really cool how they solely concentrate on world building. But the key is, don't make it too confusing for your reader, because if the reader can't visualize the world and doesn't feel like the culture and the language and the history is believable, chances are they're not going to like your book. Right? So, if that's all you want to know, you can stop watching now, but now I'm just going to go on about examples of good world building. Sorry, I'm coughing a bit here. So my favorite examples include Hyperion, and the way that they build the world is through telling different stories in different ways, in different genres. So the first book, we encounter like a military type story, a first contact story, we have a detective story, we have a romance story, we have a family history, and all these different types of stories add to the world. And the world building, and I think that was a really cool way to go about building this massive world, because it's not just, you know, one planet, it's like a whole universe that he's trying to describe here, and I thought that was a brilliant way to do it. Malazan, Book of the Fallen series. I love this series because it's one of those ones where it just takes you and it drops you in. You get no context, you don't learn what's going on if you're not paying attention, you have no expert guiding you, you're just kind of along for the ride. The way I look at Malazan is that it kind of just drops you on a train in the middle of nowhere. You don't know where you are, no one around you is speaking the language that you speak, and you just gotta figure out where you are, figure out the culture and the language so that you can communicate. It's really cool. It's like you're kind of like a detective in the story trying to understand what's going on. And each book adds like new stuff. It's really cool. Discworld is great at world building. I mentioned Two Flower in the first 2 books, but you don't have to read it in that order. It's just through 40 books, how can you not develop a great world? Dune. Dune is a great example of using education. So we get the education of the main character, and that informs the reader of the world. So we are kind of like the student listening to the teacher, learning about the world. Lord of the Rings is the ultimate world building example, obviously. We learn about it through songs, through history, through extended world building texts, the Silmarillion, for example. If you really want to know more about Middle-earth, read that. The Wheel of Time, I'll mention it again, just because it has so many different cultures that we get to experience with the characters as they travel. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, we have this new character who's introduced to an already established world, learning about it, and he's standing in as a substitute for the reader, learning about the world. Stranger in a Strange Land is another great example. It's kind of meta in that we have this character from outside of Earth coming to Earth and learning about Earth, which I think was a great way to kind of world build something that we kind of think we already know, right? So I thought that was really cool, and it kind of told us about that character as well in his world because of the way he interacted with our world. Yes, so I'm also going to include examples of what I consider bad world building. So example, Starship Troopers, which tries to do the education thing, but that's all the book is. It's just the same thing over and over and over and over again, and he never actually gets out into the world to apply those lessons, which I think is important. We see that in Dune. We see him in class learning these things, and then we see him out there applying those skills. Whereas in Starship Troopers, all we get is him sitting in class learning these things, but not actually able to use those things. Another example of bad world building is changing the feeling of a world. And this happened for me with Perdido Street Station. I loved the first like 4/5 of Perdido Street Station. And if it had stayed in that same style and that same kind of gritty world that we were in, that book would have been one of my favorite books of all time. But that last 1/5 felt like it was written by a totally different author. The world felt like it completely changed, and I was like, what is going on? Like, what happened to, like, all the stuff that came before that was so beautiful and gritty and gross and lovely? Now you just, like, gonna switch it all up on me? No, don't do that. Don't do that, please. Another thing is that you can't rely on readers to pick up references. For example, I haven't read it, but I have heard it, that Ready Player One has a lot of references to 80s things, and sometimes it does kind of list them off. And if you don't know what those things are, you're not going to get it. And the world is going to kind of fall a little flat for you because, you know, I don't know what 16 Candles is about. That's a movie, right? I think I've seen it, but I can't remember the name. Pretty in Pink. You know, like, I honestly don't think I've ever seen that movie. I know it's a movie, but if you reference that in a book and relied on me to get that reference in order to build your world, it's not going to work. You have to be more explicit. And that could also be a personal preference. I know a lot of people like Ready Player One. I know a lot of people like Starship Troopers. And a lot of people like all the other ones that I think are bad. So it's, you know, world building comes down to personal preference at the same time, at the end of the day. So that's it. My battery's about to die. I think I've rambled on for quite a long time. Thank you for sticking with me. Let me know what your favorite novel that does great world building is, and maybe what you don't like in world building. You know, a book that fell flat for you because of the way the world was built. And thank you for watching.